Thank you, everyone, for having me. My name is Scott Wentland. I'm from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. And I'm going to present today a couple of items related to measuring the environmental goods and services sector in the U.S. The organizers had asked me to not only present on our research that you can find on the National Bureau of Economic Research's website, called Accounting for Environmental Activity, with my co-authors, including Tina Heifel is also one of the co-authors on this research paper. But the organizers also asked me to touch on some guidance that came out of the White House this past fall or this summer that is on accounting for ecosystem services in benefit cost analysis. So I'll touch on that near the end. So what do we do in the research that I highlighted here is we have the first attempt in the US to create a SIA central framework based pilot estimates of environmental activity in the US economy. Effectively, what we're trying to do is we're trying to quantify what you might call the green economy, or the environmental goods and services sector in particular, which is the international standards. The SIA Central Framework for Environmental Accounting defines this as environmental activities whose primary purpose is to reduce or eliminate pressures on the environment or to make efficient use of natural resources. So effectively, environmental protection and environmental resource management activities in the economy as we currently measure it. So to do this, we take a satellite account approach. I won't have enough time to really get into a lot of the details, so you'll have to go to our paper to read about more of the details about our approach. But basically, we take a similar approach that we've done with a number of other satellite accounts using detailed supply and use table data that Tina had mentioned in our construction of other satellite accounts like the digital economy. But we draw on a very detailed data of the US economy that includes thousands of product categories that really break down the economy into very fine, relatively fine bits so that we can reconstruct those activities into a coherent thematic account of a certain type of activity, in this case, the environmental goods and services sector. We draw on some other data sources that we talk more about in the paper. I'll leave that for later. And I'll also just briefly mention our methodology here, but again, we have more details in the paper itself. But basically, we draw on experience from other countries, namely the EU, as well as some prior efforts in the US for our classification of these activities. And then we break down our activities into categories that are consistent with how other countries, in particular a number of the EU countries, have broken down these activities, which are in two broad categories: the classification of environmental protection activities and the classification of resource management activities. So. And then there's a number of sub-classifications within those. So I have a couple tables here, which I'll just briefly show because they're a little hard to read the numbers, but we've broken down the environmental goods and services sector across all of these categories that are relevant for both policymakers and a variety of users, potentially. But we had only done this, since this was sort of a pilot effort. These aren't official accounts as of yet. But we've only done this for 2015 and 2019. But the bottom line sort of takeaway here is that we estimate that the environmental goods and services sector in 2015 in the US was about $620 billion. And in 2019, $724 billion. And this is broadly in line, at least as a percentage of total output, with some of the numbers that are coming out of the EU and elsewhere around the world. Now we have a couple different approaches to get these numbers that we outline in the paper, which I don't really have enough time to go into here. But I actually want to sort of visualize this data a little bit differently. So one of the other sort of main takeaways in our evaluation of the environmental goods and services sector is that a lot of what we would consider the green economy, at least in the US, and with other countries around the world that have broken down the green economy in a similar way and sort of rooted in the international standards of the Sea Essential Framework, is that they've found that the green economy isn't just manufacturing of solar panels or windmills or things like that. That's certainly in there. So we have 10% of the U.S.'s environmental goods and services sector is in that heat, energy, savings, and management category. But the vast majority of it are in relatively banal categories like waste management, management of water, and wastewater management. So those are the sort of the big players in this economy, in this sector in particular. So I will skip over this slide. Again, the numbers are hard to read, but you can go to the paper to see those in more detail. But I just want to highlight one other point that we saw. One of the other main takeaways from our pilot study here was that we also had broken this down, the green economy, into the sort of the private sector environmental goods and services and the public sector environmental goods and services. In the US, we found about 27 or 28% of the expenditures in this sector was from the public sector, which we have the caveat in the paper that this may be sort of lower bound estimate of this because we are undercounting to some extent some of the public sector expenditures. And then we just sort of highlight here that it's clear from, if you look at some of these categories in more detail, where some of these categories like protection of biodiversity and landscapes, our vast majority of that spending is in the public sector, whereas in other categories like waste management, the vast majority is in the private sector. And so you can see those from some of our charts in the paper. So finally, again, one of our main takeaways is that we do have this quantitatively significant sector in our economy that we don't yet produce official statistics for. This is only a pilot effort, but as of 2019, we found that about 1.9% of total gross output was of these types of environmental activities that we associate with the environmental goods and services sector. I already touched on a couple of these other broader takeaways, so I won't reiterate them right here. But we will also note that even for our own very detailed data that we have in the US, that there were some imperfections with aligning definitions of our product level data from our supply and use table data available in the US, and its mapping to what the international standards would consider to be a certain defined environmental good or service. And so some of that imperfections of mapping these products to these definitions is an inherent challenge that you're going to have in national statistics and national accounts when you're creating these thematic accounts, and it certainly is the case for this one as well. In my last minute or so, I will just touch on briefly in August 2023, the White House had released guidance on accounting for ecosystem services and benefit cost analysis. They were calling for public comment on this, but actually it closed in the last week or so. But I just want to highlight one point here, which I think maybe in the discussion this will come up if we talk more about some of the challenges of ecosystem services and measurement related to that. That one thing I wanted to point out when we're talking about guidance of use of the accounts for benefit cost analysis is that the national accounts are often focused on what economists would consider the price times quantity, right? In our, going back to our basic supply and demand diagrams. But benefit cost analysis is a broader analysis which accounts for welfare and consumer surplus. And so the guidance in the case of this has some key differences with the national accounts, where in the national accounts we don't actually account for consumer surplus and measure this. So maybe we can get more into this discussion since I'm out of time, but I just wanted to highlight that this is a case that that even in some of the satellite accounts that we do measure, that we have this issue, especially in the digital economy, where a lot of these free goods have much of its value comes from consumer surplus. And certainly, excuse me, and certainly in environmental goods, this is even more so the case, where you have these free goods where much of the welfare value is going to be to consumers, where there's going to be little or no market value. So we can continue that in the discussion, but I will leave it there. Thank you very much. I'm Scott Wentland. Thank you for having me.